Welcome to this video on searching the Federal Register of Legislation. When you are looking for legislation produced by the Commonwealth Parliament, and that of course includes delegated legislation like regulations and rules, you can find authorised versions of those materials on the Federal Register of Legislation. Now this is the home page, and you can of course start searching using this search box here, but it's probably going to help you narrow down your search more quickly by using the tabs across the top here. So as you can see here, there is access to the Australian or Commonwealth Constitution, and you see you can click on that and then select the link, and it will take you through to the latest version. Note that when we move down, there's a little summary of information at the beginning, and then it moves into the contents page. Let's now move to looking at acts. So when we tap on acts, you'll see it gives us the option of a principle in force, an amending in force, and no longer in force. So if an act has been repealed, you will find it under the no longer in force section. Amending in force means that the piece of legislation that you would be looking at isn't the main act, it's actually an act amending another act. So for example, it might say insert the word or in section 4, insert the word knowingly in section 38. So it collects all the amendments together in one piece of legislation. In most cases, you won't be looking for an amending act. You will be looking for the principal act, as in the main act. You'll be looking at what the law says in the legislation that was passed by Parliament on the topic. So you'll be wanting to look at principle in force. So let's go there and have a look. At this point, we're taken through to a search area. Now it is narrowed down. It's looking within the Acts section of the website and the principal collection rather than the amending or no longer in force sections. So it's narrowed down the search for us already. We then need to type in the name of the legislation that we're looking for. Now at this point we need to conduct a search, and we're going to be looking for the Family Law Act 1975. Now if you're not sure of the name of the act, what you can do is just use common words or phrases that you think will appear in the act title. So let me give you an example. Let's say that we don't know it's called the Family Law Act 1975. So let's just type in family law and see what happens. So if we conduct a search, you can see at the moment that it's saying that it's going to search in the name and text. So what that means is it's going to search for the phrase that we've written here, which is family law, and it's going to search for it in the name, which is the title of the act, but also the text of the act, so the body of the act. Now that's going to produce quite a lot of results because it's looking for that phrase anywhere within any of the sections of the act as well as the title. And if it finds it in just one place, it will return it as a hit. Let's have a look. So you can see that it's produced 139 results. Let's just have a look down. So for example, somewhere in the Airports Act 1996, the phrase family law appears. It's clearly not in the title, but it must be in the body of the text somewhere. So you can see it returns quite a large number of hits, and that's going to make it quite difficult to find the legislation on the topic. However, if we narrow the search here to just name only, which of course means the title of the act, then what we'll find is that it produces fewer hits because it's looking for this phrase in the title only. So let's have a look. And if we scroll down, you can see that it's only produced 5 hits this time, and all of them have the phrase family law in the title. Now the act that we're looking for is the Family Law Act 1975. Now just going back up, because one more tip about using this search box here. So if you know that a word or phrase appears in the title, then narrow the search down to name rather than name in text. You'll get fewer hits that way. But there's also a search box here. What this search box does is give you the option of expanding or restricting the scope of the search. So for example, if you select at least one of the words, it will expand the search because then it will look for the word family anywhere in the text or law anywhere in the text. And if it finds either of those words, it will return it as a hit. Now, obviously the word law and the word family probably appear on their own throughout many pieces of legislation. So that will create a huge number of hits for you to go through. You could also select contains all the words, so that would be searching for all the words that you've entered into the text box here, so you could add additional words if you were trying to further refine the scope of the search and make it as narrow as possible. You could select contains the phrase, which tells the computer that this is a phrase rather than two independent words that you're looking for. Or you could use starts with. Now, depending on what you're looking for and depending on the number of hits that you're turning out, you may need to use this box as well as the name or name and text options to be able to find what you're looking for. Now, the one that we're looking for is the Family Law Act 1975, so let's click on that. And then what you can see is that it's produced the latest version of the Family Law Act 1975, and it tells us both here and up here that this version is current to the 28th of November 2023. Now what that means is that the Act has been amended and all of the amendments that have occurred have been consolidated into the Act that you now see here before you. But the Act only includes those amendments up to this date, so up to the 28th of November 2023. So for example, if the Commonwealth Parliament had passed legislation in January 2024, the amendments will not be included in this version that we see here because it's only current up to 28th of November 2023. So as a lawyer, if you're conducting legal research and you need to know what the law is today, you would need to check whether there had been any further amendments to the Family Law Act post, so beyond the 28th of November 2023. Let's assume that this is the current version. You'll notice that as we move down, we've got the contents page telling us what the Act contains. We also have an electronics contents page on the side here. You'll see that there are 2 volumes to this Act, so it's a really large Act. And we need to click the plus button to expand the contents page and see what is contained in volume 1. And you can see that it's split into parts. And let's just look at part 1 first. And you'll see that now we've managed to get to the actual sections themselves, and part 1 contains sections 1 all the way through to section 8. And if we click on, let's just click on, say, interpretation section 4, it takes us straight to that section. So the electronic contents page is very helpful when you're wanting to navigate to specific parts of the Act rather than having to scroll endlessly, especially if it's a large Act. Note that you can also download a PDF version just here or a Word version of the Act if you would like to download it and read it on paper. So let's just go up to these tabs up here. So if we click on details, it just gives us a little bit of information about when it was registered, the Act number and the year. We can then move to authorizers. And what this does is tells us all of the delegated legislation and all of the relevant proclamations that are related to this particular Act. So just to give you an example, let's scroll down. You can see that pursuant to the Family Law Act 1975, some regulations have been created on the Child Abduction Convention. So the Family Law Child Abduction Convention Regulations 1986 are authorized by the Family Law Act 1975. So if we just click on that now, you can see that it takes us through to that delegated legislation. So when you're trying to find out the law on a particular topic, there may be regulations as well as an Act that govern that particular area. And the Federal Register of Legislation helps you locate the delegated legislation through that Authorizers tab at the top there. One other tab that's important is the All Versions. If we click on that, it will take us through to earlier versions of the legislation. Now, that's important because when you're advising a client, you advise them on the law that was in operation. We say in force, but in operation on the day of their issue or the day of their alleged offence. So we have to look backwards in time at what the law was at that point. So for example, if your client has got a situation that arose 2 years ago, you'd need to know what the law said 2 years ago, not what it says today. So you may need to find an older version of the legislation, and you can do that under the relevant tab. So you can see that the current version was updated by the Federal Courts Legislation Amendment Judicial Immunity Act 2023, which made changes to the Family Law Act. We could click on this link to actually go through to that amending legislation and look at what that amending act says if we wanted to. So this amending legislation has been incorporated into the consolidated version of the legislation up to the 28th of November 2023. But we could look at a previous version. Let's look at the 1st of March 2023. The Family Law Act 1975, but the compilation date of the 1st of March 2023. So that's how to find older versions of the Act when you need to. Okay, let's move to looking at legislative instruments. So let's say that you don't know what the authorising act is called, but you know that there's delegated legislation on the topic. You can actually go to the Legislative Instruments tab and click there. And then again, you can see that you've got the option of selecting principle in force, a piece of amending delegated legislation that's in force or no longer in force, just like you can with acts. Note that regulations often sunset. What that means is that when they reach a particular age or a particular point in time, they are in effect repealed and therefore retired and no longer operate. So you can look at sunsetting under that particular link there. But let's have a look at principle in force. And let's say again that we're looking at family law. We don't know that the Family Law Act is the authorising act. So let's just type in family law here. And we've got the same search criteria. So if we search for name and text, it's going to look in the title and the body of the regulation, which will produce a wider result because it's looking throughout every single section for the phrase family law. If we narrow it down to just name, i.e. title of the delegated legislation, and click search. Now let's just say that we're looking for the Family Law Fees Regulations 2022. If we click on that, just like with the acts, it takes us through to the page where we can read the text. It tells us what the latest version is. We can scroll down and see that, or we can use the electronic menu on the side to take us through to particular sections if we want to. Note that we can still download a PDF and Word document. We can click on details, and it tells us that these regulations are effective for a period of 10 years, so up until 2033, and then it will sunset. As you can see, it tells you here about sunsetting. Note that it also tells us what the primary act is, the authorising act. So you can see here that it's referring to two. There are two pieces of legislation that authorise these regulations. So you could then click on those and go through and read those acts if you need to. And you can click on all versions if, again, you need to find an older version of the regulation. But in this case, it looks like this is the first version. In some cases, there will be several versions of regulations and you'll be able to find the previous versions here. That brings me to the end of this video. Now remember that you can't break this database, so feel free to have a play with all the search functions under all of the tabs in the database to get used to finding acts and delegated legislation and information that you need.